The hidden psychology of marriage. What families quietly pass down. There's an old proverb from East Asia that says, when buying a cow, look at the calf. When choosing a wife, look at her mother. At first glance, the saying may sound blunt, perhaps even a little uncomfortable to modern ears, but beneath its simplicity lies a remarkably sophisticated insight about human relationships. The proverb is not really about cattle, and it is not merely about mothers-in-law. It is about something deeper, the invisible inheritance of human behavior. Marriage, contrary to the romantic narratives we often hear, is rarely just the union of two individuals. More often, it is the meeting of two psychological ecosystems, two systems of habits, values, conflict, styles, and emotional patterns that were quietly formed long before the couple ever met. When two people fall in love, they see each other as individuals. But when two people marry, they bring with them the entire architecture of the families that shape them. And this architecture is powerful. The silent education of the family. Human beings do not suddenly invent their relationship style as adults. The way we speak during conflict, the way we tolerate discomfort, the way we draw emotional boundaries, even the way we decide whether to repair a relationship or abandon it. These patterns are rarely spontaneous. They are learned early. Children observe how their parents handle disagreement. They watch how affection is expressed. They see whether problems are solved through dialogue, avoidance, power struggles, or withdrawal. Over time, these observations become internalized. What begins as imitation slowly becomes habit, and habit eventually hardens into personality. By the time someone reaches adulthood, many of these patterns feel so natural that they are experienced, not as learned behaviors, but as personal identity. This is why the ancient proverb still resonates today. Looking at the family someone comes from is not about judgment. It is about understanding the environment that shaped their relational instincts. A difficult question for parents. Now consider this situation. A son gets married, or a daughter brings home a spouse. At first, everything appears normal. But over time, tension begins to grow between the new spouse and the extended family. Phone calls become less frequent. Visits become shorter. Small misunderstandings accumulate. Eventually, the parents begin asking themselves a difficult question. Is this conflict temporary, or is it structural? In other words, is the tension simply a passing emotional reaction, something that will soften with time? Or is it rooted in deeper personality patterns that were formed long before the marriage began? This distinction is not easy to recognize. But for families navigating marital conflict, it can make the difference between temporary strain and permanent estrangement. The psychological shift that happens in the early 30s. To understand this process more clearly, we need to look at an interesting psychological transition that often occurs between the 20s and the early 30s. Many relationship conflicts begin in a person's 20s, but the nature of those conflicts can change dramatically with age. In the 20s, emotional reactions tend to dominate. When someone distances themselves from family relationships during this stage, the language they use usually reflects emotional distress. I'm overwhelmed right now. I feel hurt. I just need space for a while. These statements are often situational. They describe a temporary emotional state rather than a permanent worldview. As a result, there is often still room for reconciliation. Emotions shift, circumstances change, time softens things, but something different begins to happen in the early 30s, when emotion turns into identity. In the early 30s, emotional reactions frequently become reorganized into belief systems. Feelings are no longer expressed as temporary experiences. Instead, they are reframed as principles. A person no longer says, "I'm hurt right now." Instead, they say, "This is who I am." Statements begin to sound like this: "I'm just not the kind of person who gets emotionally attached to family. I cut off relationships that make me uncomfortable. That's simply my personality." Notice the shift. What was once an emotional response becomes a declaration of identity. And once a behavior becomes part of someone's identity, it becomes much harder to challenge. Because now disagreement is interpreted not as dialogue, but as a rejection of the self. When someone believes their behavior reflects their core values, criticism feels like a personal attack. And that is where conflict becomes extremely difficult to resolve. The stage of justification. This psychological moment can be called the stage of justification. It is the point at which personal decisions are no longer explained through emotion, but through moral language. Instead of saying, "I'm upset," people begin to say, "This is the right way to live." Words like these often appear: respect, boundaries, self-protection, independence, autonomy. These words are powerful and important concepts in modern psychological discourse. But in certain conflicts, they can also function as defensive structures, logical frameworks used to justify emotional distance. For example, I deserve respect, so I can't maintain relationships that make me uncomfortable. Or my mental health comes first, so I have the right to cut off any relationship that drains me. On the surface, these statements sound entirely reasonable, and in many situations, they may indeed be justified. But in family dynamics, they can also become tools of relational closure, ways of ending discussion rather than continuing it. Once a relationship conflict is framed in moral language, compromise becomes extremely difficult because moral beliefs are not negotiated. They are defended. 3 patterns that often appear in marriage. In many marriages where extended family conflict escalates, 3 recurring patterns can be observed. 1. Calm, rational framing at the beginning. Early in the marriage, the spouse often appears thoughtful and reasonable. They might say things like, "I think it's healthy for couples to set clear boundaries with parents." Defining expectations early can prevent future misunderstandings. To observers, this can sound mature and balanced. Friends and relatives may even praise the person for being thoughtful and self-aware. The hidden challenge, however, is that these boundaries are sometimes not flexible guidelines, but fixed rules. 2. Conflict turns conversation into judgment. When disagreements arise later, those rules quickly become standards for evaluation. For example, "I already told you that makes me uncomfortable. That crosses my boundary." At this stage, discussion stops being negotiation. It becomes a ruling. Instead of 2 people exploring solutions together, one person begins declaring what is acceptable and what is not. 3. Immediate disconnection when standards are challenged. Finally, if the partner hesitates or attempts to defend their parents, the conflict may escalate rapidly. Statements might appear like this: "So you're not on my side. You're ignoring my boundaries. This relationship doesn't protect me." The outcome can be swift: reduced contact, refused visits, eventually, sometimes long-term estrangement. And what makes this situation particularly difficult is that the behavior does not appear explosive. In fact, it often appears calm, logical, and principled, which is precisely why it can be so hard to address. Understanding without condemning. It is important to pause here and clarify something. The purpose of examining these patterns is not to condemn individuals. Every relationship conflict has multiple perspectives, and every person brings their own experiences, wounds, and expectations into marriage. The goal is simply to understand the structure of relational dynamics, because without understanding structure, families often misinterpret what they are seeing. Parents may wonder why a relationship suddenly became rigid. Spouses may feel confused about when disagreements turned into permanent divisions. But when we examine the psychology carefully, we often discover that these changes did not happen overnight. They develop slowly through the transformation of emotion into belief, belief into identity, and identity into moral certainty. And once that process is complete, reconciliation becomes much more complicated. A question worth reflecting on. So perhaps the ancient proverb was not merely offering advice. Perhaps it was offering a warning. When we enter marriage, we do not simply join our lives with another person. We also encounter the emotional history, relational habits, and philosophical assumptions that shaped them. And those invisible inheritances can quietly shape the future of the family. Understanding that truth does not guarantee harmony, but it does give us something invaluable: clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the first step toward wisdom. If this lecture helped you see family relationships from a deeper psychological perspective, consider sharing it with others who may be navigating similar questions. And if you enjoy thoughtful explorations of philosophy, psychology, and human relationships, please subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who might find it meaningful. When marriage turns into a choice, the husband's hidden dilemma. In the previous part of our discussion, we examined how emotional reactions in relationships can slowly evolve into something much more rigid. What begins as temporary feelings can gradually become beliefs, and those beliefs can eventually solidify into personal identity. Once that transformation occurs, conflict is no longer about a single disagreement. It becomes about who someone believes they are and what they believe is morally right. And when a disagreement reaches that stage, reconciliation becomes far more difficult. But this psychological structure creates another important question. If one partner becomes increasingly certain about their position, where does the other partner stand? In many marriages experiencing deep family conflict, there is a person who becomes quietly trapped in the middle. That person is often the husband, the person who collapses first. When a marriage enters the stage of long-term estrangement from extended family, the first person whose emotional stability begins to erode is frequently not the parents, and not even the spouse initiating the distance. It is the partner standing in between. The husband, in many of these cases, gradually loses three critical roles at the same time. First, he can no longer act as a mediator. Second, he is increasingly forced into a binary choice between his wife and his parents. Third, he becomes the target of continuous criticism from below. These three pressures rarely appear all at once. They emerge gradually, often disguised as reasonable conversations. But over time, they create a psychological position that is extremely difficult to sustain. Let us examine how these patterns tend to unfold in real life. Pattern 1, mediation, becomes betrayal. In healthy family systems, a spouse can act as a bridge. They can translate emotions, soften misunderstandings, and help two sides reach a compromise. But in the long-term estrangement stage, something very different begins to happen. The moment the husband steps into the middle, he is no longer seen as a mediator. He is seen as a traitor. Consider several common situations. A husband may say gently, "Maybe my parents were just feeling hurt," but the response he receives might be immediate. "The fact that you're saying that means you're not on my side." Or he might attempt to calm tensions by saying, "I'll talk to him and try to smooth things out." Instead of appreciation, the response might be, "Why are you trying to make this harder for me?" Even a modest suggestion, such as briefly visiting parents during a holiday, can trigger a sharp reaction. Then you go by yourself. "I'm not going back into that relationship." Over time, something subtle but powerful occurs. The husband learns that any attempt at mediation creates more conflict. And once that pattern is repeated enough times, mediation stops altogether. At that point, silence replaces negotiation. Pattern 2, the disappearance of the middle ground. The second structural change is even more difficult. The husband gradually discovers that neutrality is no longer allowed. In the early stages of conflict, couples may argue, but still maintain a shared space where compromise is possible. But once estrangement becomes deeply justified, that gray area disappears. The conversation begins to sound like this: "If you truly understand me, then you should stop contacting your parents. Or, if you keep bringing them up, maybe we need to rethink this relationship." Sometimes the language becomes even more direct. "If you're on my side, then this topic should never come up again. And the most psychologically difficult statement is often the simplest. If you can't choose, then you've already chosen. This structure is emotionally devastating because it forces the husband into an impossible position. No matter what he does, someone loses. If he supports his parents, he betrays his spouse. If he supports his spouse, he abandons his parents. And if he tries to stand in the middle, both sides see him as unreliable. Pattern 3 explanation is over-judgment begins. The third stage marks a profound shift in communication. In earlier phases of conflict, couples argue. They debate. They try to explain themselves. But once the estrangement becomes fully justified, explanations disappear. Instead, evaluation begins. The spouse initiating distance no longer feels the need to explain the reasoning behind her position. From her perspective, the explanation has already been given. Now the problem is simply that the husband fails to understand. So the conversation changes. Instead of dialogue, the husband hears statements like, "I've explained this so many times. Why don't you understand yet?" Or, "Do you really think it's normal not to understand this?" Sometimes the criticism becomes personal. You don't seem to have much empathy, or even harsher. If you're still defending them after everything, maybe you're just like them. At that point, the husband is no longer treated as a partner in discussion. He becomes the object being evaluated. His character, loyalty, and emotional intelligence are placed on trial. From mediator to enforcer, when these three patterns combine, something fundamental changes in the structure of the marriage. The husband's role transforms completely. He is no longer a mediator between two sides. Instead, he becomes the executor of the estrangement. He is the one who stops calling his parents. He is the one who declines invitations. He is the one who tells relatives that visits are no longer possible. In other words, he becomes the person who implements the separation, even if the decision was not originally his. And if he does not fully understand this structure, the psychological consequences can be severe. Many husbands begin to feel isolated without knowing exactly why. They cannot clearly identify the moment when things changed. They simply feel that, step by step, their space for independent judgment disappeared. Warning signs parents should notice. For parents observing these dynamics from the outside, certain signals are especially important. These signals suggest that the situation is no longer a temporary emotional conflict, but a structural transformation within the marriage. One of the clearest warning signs is the absence of regret. When estrangement becomes fully justified, the person initiating it no longer expresses doubt. Instead, they may say things like, "I don't regret cutting them off at all," or, "Even if I went back in time, I would make the same decision." Sometimes the reflection becomes even stronger. "Honestly, I should have done it earlier." What matters here is not the words themselves. It is the complete absence of hesitation. There is no ambivalence, no sadness, no lingering question about whether the decision might have been too severe. The separation has become morally certain. When separation becomes a story of personal growth. A second signal appears when past estrangement is reinterpreted as a story of personal development. Instead of seeing the event as a painful conflict, the person begins to describe it as a turning point that strengthened their character. You might hear statements like, "That experience made me much stronger," or, "That's when I learned how to set proper boundaries," or even, "That situation helped me clarify my values." Once estrangement becomes part of a personal growth narrative, it becomes very difficult to reverse. Because abandoning the decision would mean questioning the story that now defines personal progress. The final condition of relationship. The third signal is perhaps the most decisive. The relationship itself becomes conditional. Instead of being grounded in family ties or marriage bonds, it becomes dependent on complete agreement. Statements begin to sound like this: "If you can't understand my choice, it's hard to continue this relationship." Or, "If you can't accept my decision, maybe we shouldn't keep meeting." At that moment, the relationship is no longer unconditional. It exists only under the condition of full psychological alignment. And that is a very fragile foundation for any family. Why this moment requires serious reflection. When these three signals appear together, no regret, a growth narrative, and conditional acceptance, the situation has moved beyond ordinary marital conflict. It indicates that the marriage structure itself has become conditional. This does not automatically mean the marriage will collapse, but it does mean the problem cannot be solved simply by waiting for time to pass. Time rarely changes a structure that has already become part of someone's identity. A final reflection. An old classical phrase says,
慎重思考
以家安危. It means careful judgment determines the safety of the entire household. Marriage is never just a personal decision. It reshapes the relationships between parents and children, siblings and relatives, and eventually influences the emotional environment of the next generation. For that reason, family conflicts should not be approached with hatred or blame. They should be approached with clarity, because the stability of a family is rarely preserved by emotion alone. It is preserved by wise judgment. If you found this discussion meaningful, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next lecture. In the next episode, we will explore why individuals in their late 30s who adopt estrangement patterns often become the most predictable yet the least reversible type, and how those patterns gradually solidify into a complete worldview. And if this conversation offered useful insight, please like the video and share it with someone who may benefit from understanding these dynamics. When it comes to family, recognizing a problem early is always less painful than discovering it too late.